The work that began at Bergenworth. Whispers and accused glances caused the professional environment that is the Bergenworth lecture hall to appear more like a children's school. In it, Maria grew more and more frustrated, while growing smaller and smaller in the grand lecture hall, alone in the upper row. Forced to place herself there because of the judging looks that started as soon as she entered the room. Admittedly, she was not overtly astonished at the reaction. It was a thing accustomed to her by now, each time she ventured outside of her family's walls. The aggravation simply had to run its course. She constantly told herself to ignore it, that she had suffered through much worse. Nothing was to be the same again, and that it was a good thing, despite providing new social hurdles to overcome. Luckily, the subject on the anatomy of the human body was quite interesting and was distracting enough. The lefternmost door opened loudly enough to make the lecturer stutter. Much like her own late coming, although within a much more acceptable time frame, she now was on the beholder's side of the spectacle. He quickly looked over, but ignored casually the young man that had now entered and continued on with his showcase of the blackboard drawings. The stranger was about the same age as the other students, with light brown hair that almost reached his shoulders. By the tool belt and dirty hands, he must have come to do some form of maintenance. But during class, he was well built, seemingly from hard work. Despite her own disdain towards unfit behavior in the lecture hall, she could not help herself to be intrigued by the man. After all, he was rather handsome. Her thoughts would suddenly take on new speculations when the man did not start to act like the property groundskeeper, but as a student. He nodded apologetically towards the lecturer and walked up amongst the observation seats. He sat down in the middle row, closest to the walkway, picked up a notebook, exchanged a few words with his deskmate, and borrowed some of his ink. She was now unnecessarily captivated by the mystery man who had invaded the session. She peered about to spot anyone that might share in her confusion. But he might just as well have been a ghost. None had paid any heed. It was agreed that all would reconvene tomorrow in the laboratory for examination. Until then, they were to study the books and bring with them notes, so they would be able to, with some assistance, conduct a dissection of a chosen organ. All while the strange groundskeeper was diligently taking notes and nodding with interest like a proper student. When the students dispersed at the end of the reading, Maria decided to linger and observe the masquerading groundskeeper's next move. The group he had seated himself with stayed behind as well, all having their attention to him. Who was this supposed to be? They all seemed rather focused on him, an informal leader of sorts. Her juvenile thoughts provoked her slightly, and she countered that Bergenworth was nothing like any institute of learning. But there was a notion deep within her mind that insisted that these were just like the unruly children from school. She finally decided to make her exit and gathered up her things to leave, like a mouse sneaking past the cat. One of them, a man with black hair tied behind his head, turned to her and waved for her to come over. Initially she was struck by anxiety of past trauma, She acted maturely and walked on over while discreetly dreading the meeting despite lacking good reasons for doing so. Silently she came closer, walking between the rows, awkwardly clutching her books to her chest. The man who had waved her over looked kindly towards her. He sat partially leaning over his armrest, intruding slightly on the mystery student's seat. Next to him sat two women, both looking at her. "I've noticed you are new," he started. "A bit surprising to appear some days after the fact. Yet I thought it polite to bid you welcome all the same. My name is Lawrence." He reached out his hand to her behind the back of the mystery man. So far, he had never tilted his head her way and made good efforts in ignoring the strained greeting, all of his focus aimed at a book he was writing in. Maria was caught unmoving as the uncomfortable nerves from before ran off her. "I am Maria. It's a pleasure." She gracefully laid her hand in his. "We were going to read up on the lakeside terrace. If you would like, you could join us. Perhaps we can even give you a small introduction of the place." "How kind of you. That would be lovely." He smiled at her. He stood and carefully squeezed himself in between his roommate, who was still engrossed in his notes. The man leaned back in his seat and brought the book, with the pen still to the paper, as Lawrence passed. When he stood in front of her, he gestured towards the two ladies seated beyond. This is..." A hand shot out towards her behind the unfortunate man caught between them all.
"Luna,"
she interrupted. She had a sharp chin and vibrant green eyes. Her hair fastened sloppily in a large, dark flowing ponytail.
"Charmed."
"Oh, likewise." Maria smiled and gently took her hand. It was shaken firmly, almost bumping into the shoulder of the still seated man. While she was crowding her way out in the aisle, she pointed a thumb back at the last woman.
"And that there is Carol, equally charmed."
The woman, Carol, looked up at her at the mentioning of her own name. She smiled shyly and waved lightly to her. She appeared to be a bit younger than the rest, perhaps even in Maria's own age. Her blonde hair was tied in a neat bun on the back of her head.
"To the library?"
Luna and Lawrence were quick to begin walking down towards the exit. When Carol had moved past him, the mystery man finally looked up and watched the three waiting by the master's desk. He closed the book and turned to her. The corner of his mouth turned into a sly smile. His eyes were a piercing grey with a tint of blue, or perhaps green. He stood up calmly, turning to her. "Gammon, nice meeting you." It was the time of year when the leaves suddenly shifted from their lush green into the vibrant colors of fall. Paired with the setting sun, the world was clad in an orange tint. After acquiring the proper literature and giving German a brief rundown of the part of the course he had missed, they had relocated to the front of the main building. Having given her the brief tour of the premise, they had found themselves seated beneath the lunarium, the large, protruding terrace of the upper floor. Here the lake was near with its pleasant smell of clear water and seagull song. They had all managed to fill one bench, with a view over the distant landscape.
I am dying to ask, Maria, and I hope it's appropriate.
Luna said eagerly.
But how is life in court? Any scandals you can tell us about?
Knowing well of the overly dramatic intrigue of the court, she politely deflected out of displeasure of the topic.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it is very uneventful.
What? Lawrence exclaimed and leaned forward. I don't believe you for 1 second. Are there not supposedly grandiose balls hosted every weekend? She gave him a playful look that accused him of his gullibility.
Not every weekend. And might I add, have you attended but one? You have attended them all. But how come everyone talk about them like it's the achievement of life itself to have attended?
Carol carefully jumped into the discussion with a half-sarcastic tone. Everyone likes a mystery, German speculated. They looked at him expectantly, thinking there was more to come, but he had grown content with looking out over the lake.
Right indeed. Few outside of the court partake of what lies within the castle walls. Granted, they are adept at organizing their gatherings, but it cannot be helped but to see a hollow tradition, reveling in something I feel has long since vanished.
Luna nudged her shoulder with hers.
Oh, feeling homesick already? No, and I likely never will. But by all means, continue wish for an invitation. I might suffer from some bias, as you can hear.
She added jokingly. The conversation ebbed out into the sound of the water's rhythm, and they were content with absorbing the sunset, until German asked, Is that why you came here? You were sick of home?
I suppose.
She stood up, escaping the crowded bench.
My dear mother and father were disturbed by my raving theories and endless questions into bygone matters, as they would say.
German chuckled and shook his head, making her feel like he had spotted the aggravating hypocrisy. It sounds like you are more aptly fit here than at court, Lawrence commented as he spread himself out over the recent vacant place beside him. Maria chuckled silently.
It's funny that you say so. I was worried I would not fit in at all, coming from Canehurst.
Luna jumped defiantly from the bench and stared her down.
Nonsense! Bergenworth will do good with a tad of that Canehurst looks of yours.
With Maria's pale complexion, the blushing only became more apparent, noticeable by Luna's delightful laugh.
Soon you will feel right at home.
German stood up and straightened his tool belts, looking back at the grand building. Well, it's about time I get to that squeaking door. Lest I forget about it. I'll see you tomorrow. He waved a farewell as he walked away to the lecture building. When Doris walked into the office, he first saw Willem sitting at his desk. Facing him on the other side sat a slouched man in worker's clothing. He appeared utterly misplaced in the neatly but cramped office. Willem snapped his head intensely towards him as soon as he entered. Doris, splendid. Would you have a look at this? Willem beckoned him over, and Doris placed himself at the end of the desk, looking curiously down onto the surface between the two men. A piece of stone lay flat in the middle, surrounded by every other contents of the desk that had been callously brushed aside. Mr. Norton here found this on his property. Would you tell Master Doris your story? Willem leaned back, resting one arm on the chair's rests. Mr. Norton had a weathered and tanned appearance of plentiful sun exposure, with bushy sideburns. A slightly worn brown hat lay in his lap, and he was wearing large, baggy overalls, with a smidgen of dirt at the ends.
Well, I was prospecting the lands for me cattle, you see. Doing some digging here and there, you know. Was hitting something hard while testing the soil. Turned out, 'tis was not any stone or pebble in the ground, but a whole temple, it would appear.
A temple? Doris wondered as he took the stone in his hand. It was carved very finely to the degree one would be under the impression the pattern was of natural cause. The stone could neatly be held in the cup of his two hands. One side was smooth, having been separated from a larger piece, as indicated by the cut of the flowing carving and the transition into a definitively more crude and natural-shaped rock.
Yes, or something like it. I was unable to dig the whole thing up. Knew it was special though, so I thought to bring it here.
As Doris' knowledge was rather vast in the regards of historical subjects, he pondered if the stone was of royal origin. Having been submerged in the ground, that alone made it old, perhaps even ancient. Not only was the craft made with uncanny smoothness, the stone itself was quite unfamiliar. Delaying while lost in thoughts, Willem eventually reached over a magnifying glass. He received it and held it to the piece. Indeed, the carvings had left next to no signs of tool use, like it indeed were formed naturally. But the pattern was anything but natural. The only reference he had was the ruins of the Precursor's keep, which came to mind to share some similarities with the piece in front of him. But with those, he could see the little scrapes, dents and irregularities created when using tools. Here, there were none. It's Thumeru, Willem commented with assurance. Only once it had been said did it occur fully to Doris. The chances of finding it were unlikely enough so that he was unable to make the connection. But Willem was borderline fanatical in concern to the old Thumerians. Likely the first thing he thought of upon inspecting the stone. Perhaps. It must be. You are otherwise much quicker to identify a piece. You have yet to determine its origin and thus confirmed it is indeed Thumeru. Finally. The farmer looked questioningly back and forth at them. Doris placed the stone back on the table. He looked to the provost who, after a brief stare, raised his eyebrows. Doris then turned to the farmer. An excavation party will arrive on your property. With them will be a representative that will see to your compensation. We will begin to emerge this mystery you have found, good sir. The man nodded, slowly and hesitantly. Worry not, my friend. The compensation will be great. So great that you may acquire as many grazing plots as you wish, in addition to being the luckiest farmer in all of Yharnam. The man's nod became quicker, and a smile slowly emerged.
Right. Thank ye, good scholar. Praise be. The gods' fortune upon you. I'll be waiting.
He stood and put on his hat. Then he hurried out. Will you tell German, Doris? Well, he seems rather restless. Not much for the lecture bench, that one. But incredibly brilliant. This might stimulate him in just the right manner. Oh, of course. He was thinking of leaving as well, but was caught by the tapping of Willem's fingers against the desk, which then led him to discover a frown on his face. Strange indeed, but not far off. The provost scoffed, looking off to the side. I admit, after all this time, the disparity of not finding it here. Bergenworth. And nothing. Not true. The beginning of something great. Ah, of course. The home of a shared ambition. But to find naught during the excavation, I was a mess. There might yet be some truth to the name. At any rate, it did eventually present itself to us. Just not where we thought it would. Now we can only pray it is like you say. Not pray. We will see it soon. The day had been long and fortunately graced with pleasant weather. A cool day with clouds of promised rain, but never delivering. They had broken through the dirt, roots and stones while the scholars lounged, looking over individual finds. German did not mind that the work was hard. Had he known his duties would mimic those of the current masters he now accompanied, he would surely have second-guessed his application to Bergenworth. This, however, suited him perfectly. Master Doris had personally approached him some days past with the offer to be in charge of the workers that would dig up a location of interest. The reasoning being he was technically a student with special circumstances. Said circumstances being that of laboring habits. Doris could, as he had been told, put Master Adrian in full charge, but felt he would likely only get distracted by the analytics. No, the job would need someone who took physical labor more seriously. The monotonous everyday work that entailed referencing books and conducting experiments seated in a laboratory would have grown too dull. Being equally scientifically stimulated while working with his own hands in this fashion was much more akin to his person. Topics such as history and architecture became much more appealing to study while he was physically present to see it and touch it. He and the hired workers had dug a trench along the walls of a clearly built stone structure. Despite their older age and weathered appearance, He had gotten along fine with them. One had once dug out a well at their farm, and even remembered him from the past encounter. The structure itself was of a native mineral of a darker hue. Beautiful carvings and patterns were made all over. It was intriguing from the start, as there was little sign of said structure having sunk or otherwise being buried in times past. It was positioned too perfectly straight, intentionally so. Master Adrian and Ginny had even gone so far as to speculate that perhaps this very ground could be the entryway to the ancient labyrinth Willem had sought. German did indeed have the belief this would be the day it would reveal itself. It was a notion that could only come from his intuition and natural insight, unexplainable to one that did not share in such a particular feeling of the mind. While the four men cooperated to shovel dirt out from the hole, about the depth of 12 feet and a width of 5, he himself stood near the excavated structure to examine it. Indulging in a much-needed break, he examined their progress and the structure's whole. Parts of the weathered building would loosen, pieces that he brought to the masters and the students for a closer examination.
Mr. German, come look.
One of the laborers called from the other side. The hole they had dug was in an L shape around the seemingly rectangular structure. He was currently on the short side, brushing off dirt from the mural pattern. He walked around the corner of the structure to 3 of the men standing around one who was kneeled down. He looked up and waved him over.
There's an opening here. Into a room, it feels. Come.
He walked over and crouched down beside the heavy-set man. There was indeed a small hole. Judging by the pattern around it, this was the tip of an archway. He stood hastily.
Great work!
With a simple step against the dirt, he plunged himself upward from the steep incline of the small ravine they had made for themselves. The other scholars were deep in their own work around the tables they had set up. Down the gently, barely noticeable valley descent lay old Yarnam, and beyond, on the other hill, sat the rest of town. The hill itself was not particularly steep, simply a slight elevation in the grander geography, but the grounds were not as popularized by farmers than the surrounding fields were. For whatever reason he could not speculate, since the land seemed prime for cultivation. German came up to the scholars, bent over the fragments of ruin as they were, and cleared his throat.
We have found a possible door.
Master Adrian looked up.
You have? Truly?
German gestured leisurely for him to come and see. Adrian did so, and he walked to the edge of the excavation.
My word! Well, take it up! Attention!
He turned back and clapped his hands to provoke his accomplices around the table to straighten themselves and cast attention to him.
Come here and help!
The 2 boys in German's own age came up begrudgingly.
But the samples...
One moaned in excusance.
Irrelevant. Now we want to see what's inside. That's why we are here in the first place. So, get to it.
He gave German a pat on the shoulder and went over to the wagon of supplies.
Right.
He pointed to the empty carts by the side of the slope.
Let's make a line. Grab those and start heaving the dirt out as it comes.
He placed 1 foot right on the edge and looked down to the workers. We pick up the pace, lads. Start with the ramp for the carts, then to the depths. While the hastily drafted students began their task reluctantly, German and his companions began digging out a proper walkway down to the structure. Easy work that was over soon enough, as it only became some 3 feet in width. Then began the more hardier work to systematically uncovering the opening. 2 stood right by the entry and shoveled in steady pace backwards, while the rest made sure the incline of the path remained. The flow of their work had both the students steadily walk with one cart to and fro, letting the carts be filled to rapidly be exchanged with the other, while the former departed with the dirt. German's own eagerness for uncovering the find had him in a surge, which likely was the cause of the others' morale. The only ones that justifyingly complained were the students. The sun moved behind the clouds and would peek out to cast its rays, only for short periods as it was moving on to the horizon. This made the sun partially illuminate the interior of the small chamber that had now emerged in the cleared opening. German looked inside to find it as small as one would expect. In the dark he could make out stone altars along the walls. The corners were curved and ended in pillars that covered the crevices of the walls. It was about 30 feet on the longer wall and 25 feet on the shorter. In the middle was a dark, perfectly circular hole that appeared as the beginning of a round staircase. It took up most of the floor in its size, leaving little space for one to completely walk around it against the wall. Master Adrian and Ginny shoved their way between the workers to his side. The entry was rather tall and wide. The chamber itself could well be 40 feet in height, and nearly so was the arching entry. The chamber had luckily not been filled with much soil. The lanterns the 2 masters had brought showed intricate patterns and depictions on the 4 walls. The stone slabs even had wax candles still neatly placed upon red cloth. It looked old, but not in such an ancient quality as one could believe.
There!
Ginny shot out a pointed finger and flew inside the room. She moved to the right wall and stood before the slab above the wall's altar. She indicated towards a unique and simple carving in its upper center. A line that had 2 declining lines emerging out from its middle that turned in an angle, bringing the line back towards the bottom of the center line, but not merging with it.
Thumberu! This could be it! Adrian!
She turned to him. German noted that all the different murals had the same drawn rune placed in the same spot on all 4 walls.
It is. It could be.
Adrian mumbled in awe and walked to shine the light down the spiraling path. German was transfixed by the symbol. The others seemed more eager to explore, but he was drawn to the simple symbol. When he looked upon it, he thought to sense something very familiar, innate even. He knew for certain he had never seen this simple carving ever before, or maybe he had, and just forgotten it. But what sort of meaning must it have held in order for it to remain in the depths of his memory? It was as if feelings could be communicated with simple lines, like a note that holds the tone of music, but he could not place what. He was so absorbed that when he looked to his masters, he saw only the dimmer growing light that vanished down the spiral. Peeking his head out the doorway, he found no one in sight within the ditch.
Hey, bring me some light.
Returning inside, he was eventually received by one of the workers that uninterestedly handed him a lit lantern before returning to the surface, not in the slightest sharing in the curiosity. He wanted to examine the contents of the depictions. Could they tell more of this strange provocation of the senses? In his mind was the sensation of bewilderment one can experience when some external factor perfectly formulates one's own most private thoughts without one's involvement. What he thought to see in the symbol, after some pondering, could only come from the deepest reaches of his mind, patterns of thought he knew to be only his own, and things no one else would fully understand. Further examining the surrounding patterns and smooth-shaped murals made him give more thought to the incredibly well-kept state they were in, and in extension, the people that had originally carved them. He was roused out of his speculation by the loud scream of terror coming from below. He was surprised to the degree he was undetermined how to act, and could only rapidly turn and remain idle. One of the workers came rushing back inside and turned to him confused. It was his arrival that made German leap towards the spiral. The worker yelled out for the rest to come. He scraped along the wall as he threw himself down as fast as the narrow space allowed him. He circled around many times and very deeply. Behind him he heard the clumsy footsteps of the workers. He almost stumbled on the small steps, but eventually emerged in a larger chamber with a curved ceiling. Candles burned to illuminate the room in small scones on the walls. It did not resemble a ruin, more akin to a well-preserved funerary chamber or tomb, perhaps even a place suitable for worship or even dwelling. Opposite to him was another doorway from which the screams came. They had died down into a loud and strained moan. He rushed over and first saw the limp and contorted body of Master Ginny. She lay on her stomach in a pool of blood. Her arm was twisted, laying over her back, and the head, too, seemed twisted. She definitely had the figure that spoke of being mangled. Towards him crawled Master Adrian on all fours. That is to say, his left leg was dragged behind him, with the foot facing upwards as it left a trail of thick blood after him. His eyes were wide, and he made no eye contact with German. Around a pillar, lightened by the lantern now laying next to Ginny's corpse, came a human. A human was the first thing that came to mind as it walked on two legs, had two arms and a head. It made no sounds, other than the tapping from its bare feet as it slowly walked after Adrian. It was, though, proven not to be so, kindred. It was heavily emaciated, unnaturally so, a walking skeleton with skin over the bones, discoloration of dark blue and red spots on its pale white body. The face was a dark mess, with two dark holes for eyes and a drooping mouth, also a dark void. German threw himself down to grasp at Adrian's hands to drag him away from the approaching terror. He managed to pull his master into the doorway just as two of the workers came up behind him. After a brief pause in the footsteps and a faint gasp of surprise, one briskly walked straight to the thing to punch it. It flinched with its head from the impact. Then it proceeded to bash with its narrow arms on the man's chest. German heard first a groan and air rapidly escaping his lungs. He fell promptly backwards, and the pale thing followed him down and pummeled his chest until it burst. German's fear took hold, and every sound became less audible. It grew still in his head, and he could only focus on moving Adrian up to support him on his shoulder. Then he turned around and practically dragged Adrian along, disregarding how he stumbled forward along him. Through the muffled senses, only penetrated the irregular tapping of his own stumbling feet, and the sounds of the workers' frightful voices as they each met their end to an unsightly beast.
Dear, oh dear. That is...
Willem muttered, mostly to himself while still maintaining his eyes on the bookshelf. German had promptly approached him while he seemed to search for a specific tome, and the news had now, though with no remarkable reaction, halted the search. Now he just stood. One arm leaned against the shelf, the other behind his back, which was turned against him.
It would have been extraordinary, had it not.
I'm sorry, Master Willem.
He turned his head down and was silent for a moment. Long enough for German to grow a bit uncomfortable, even with his sympathies. What did you do after you left?
What do you mean?
They did not follow. But the entry, it needs to be closed, no?
I suppose.
He turned to face him. They met each other's gaze. Willem did not appear as distraught as a man should. He seemed more intrigued by German's reaction. It was indeed the labyrinth. Tell me, German, know much of it?
As far as the stories are concerned.
I gathered. You should take a seat. They were alone in the library, as the hour had grown late. He sat down at a long table in the middle of the floor, surrounded by tall bookshelves. Willem must have perused for pleasure, as he was not dressed in his formal blue and white robes, but a leisurely shirt and vest, still of the same color scheme. He sat down opposite him. What do you think you met in there? In the ancient darkness? He thought back to the horrible encounter. The sickly white skin. The face.
I can't say. I really can't say. Something corrupted.
Willem nodded. You know the stories. How the Thumerian people
lived underground in a large city. Mere stories. Very attractive ones and very fantastical. The bestowing matron, founder of Yarnum, was supposedly their descendant. He shot a glance at him while he stretched out in his seat. German only stared intently without showing anything other than his curiosity. The truth, unbeknownst to many, is not far off. As I suspected, the Thumerians were an ancient civilization that indeed made their home underground. But why? Willem would often involve such rhetorical questions, but German did this time have an answer. The Great Ones. Willem's head snapped towards him, eyes filled with intent. The Great Ones. Indeed. In whatever form, they were close down there, and so the Thumerians built a home around them in dedication and veneration. They were willingly slaves to their will. But then they were gone, and with them, the presence of the Great Ones. He looked around, as if suddenly concerned for their privacy. He leaned over the table and spoke much more hushed. I did not include it in my latest study, but I am of the firm belief that the Great Ones did not leave. Perhaps they were never truly there. But what defines them is simply their existence on multiple planes. They are here and everywhere. Perhaps even in your head. And that's why the labyrinth is so important. German filled in. The master of Bergenworth leaned back in his chair and looked contently at him. I am not surprised to find a kindred spirit in you, German. I would suspect the same of Lawrence. You too have that aura about you, for a lack of a better word. That indistinct radiation of a calm that stems from you knowing something that others don't. Can even you explain it? He could not put it in better words. Perhaps it had been linked with a strange symbol from before. I cannot, and I make few attempts to try. But it intrigues you. You have touched upon it, and are now living with it. The great beyond. The very first impression of the eldritch truth. Once, someone, very long ago, did the same. And I believe it led to the founding of an entire people living close to that truth. The very essence of life. And they built that place. And the thing you saw is likely the abhorrent remnants of that bygone time. Does that horrify you? Not in the common sense. In what sense, then? Well, it does. But only due to the fact of what I did. If they indeed are remnants of a people in contact with the gods, it seems only fair they live in strange circumstances. Willem smiled. You wish to explore the domain of the gods, then? I very much do. It was never an option for me not to. Willem nodded faintly and breathed out heavily. He stood and paced around for a bit. It will be dangerous, my boy. But you know the gravity of it. This is a whole new plane. Yet we must face it. German stood. Let me see to it. I will keep you protected down there. Willem's previously admirable demeanor softened, mixed with pity. Oh, German, perhaps you would have. If it were but a ruin as one can imagine it. But the Thumerians was the first of a civilization, much larger than any to this date. What we found is not just some chamber with measly treasure objects. It is the start of the labyrinth, filled with horrors like you saw. You alone can do little, I'm afraid. Then I'll make sure that I'm not alone. Maria stood up and joined in the formal applaud marking the end of the presentation. As Bergenworth was an open center of research and learning, almost every lecture was attended by many students, teachers and enthusiasts alike. Students especially would frequent the lecture due to interest or encouragement. The former had been Maria's own reason, while the latter had been Carol's. Most of the onlookers made their way out, while Luna made a swift approach to them from the stage, after having discarded her protective garb. So? Not bad. Very interesting, Luna. Very dexterous work. Maria was unsure of how to further praise her morbid demonstration. Flattered, she waved off the compliment. Oh, you know, it just goes. What of it, Carol? You look a bit sick. Carol was slouched over the little armrest table, leaning in over Maria. Oh, I don't know how you can stand it. A strong stomach. And you get used to it. I would never be accustomed. Especially with the brain. It's the most intriguing part. You must have thought something of the presentation at least. It was informative. Come on. You had your eyes closed, not your ears. We worked really hard on this study. I know. And I mean it. It was really good. All right. Thank you both. She and Carol stood up from their seats. Come now, Carol. I promise I'll attend your next presentation. No promises to stay awake, though. They walked down the rows. You needn't. How goes it, by the way? Upon being encouraged, Carol's disposition changed for the better at the exchange of topic. It's everything I hoped for. Master Osmond is so clever, and the others are really nice. But I am in no rush to make any presentations. The work alone suits me just fine as it is. Oh, then we will have to sneak by while you are working then. Right, Maria? Certainly. It's good to hear you have found your passion. Speaking of, Carol started. You will continue anthropology with us? I think I will.
But you should enter the advanced course with me,
Luna excitedly and loudly suggested as they came out in the hall.
I don't know. I'm not that intrigued, unfortunately. I understand. It takes time to find your passion, but I'm sure you will find it here,
Carol encouraged.
How about advanced biology? There is someone there who really fancies you.
Luna nudged her shoulder and raised her eyebrows repeatedly.
Is that really of any significance?
Carol questioned.
You're right. Everyone fancies Maria of Canehurst. She'll have plenty attention wherever she goes.
She preferred not to be associated with the place, but understood fully why she was. It was hard not to, as shown by the sneaking glances and knee-weak fellows that came across her. Some are unbeknownst to their own beauty. Not Maria, however, as the Canehurst beauty was known widely for justified reasons. With her pale skin, grey, silvery hair, she was aware that even in court, she was known to remarkably resemble the royal features of traditional beauty.
I might try. What was it Lawrence was so fixed with again? Theology.
Luna rolled her eyes.
But he's tutored by Willem. That must be exciting at least.
She shrugged.
Sure. Try out everything. Something will suit you. In my experience, it is often what you least expect.
Maria stopped outside of a closed doorway leading into one of the study halls. The other two got ahead a few paces before noticing.
I'll find you later. I was just going to fetch some papers.
Luna raised her eyebrow in the same knowing fashion as before.
Come, Carol. Important business, as you know.
She entered swiftly and had their suspicions confirmed of who she had been expecting to find. She successfully approached the desk standing in front of the observation seats without alerting the man laying under it. She paused for a moment, lingering without him noticing.
What are you working on there?
The question seemed to startle him, and with a loud bang he slammed his head against the underside of the desk. German emerged, bewildered and with a hand on his forehead.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Did it hurt? Oh, I'm so sorry.
He looked back at her with the confusion one would expect of sudden head trauma, but it faded and was replaced with a strained smile, shaking his head, looking down, and waved away her apology.
Oh, bother. What were you saying?
Maria removed her hands from her mouth and hesitantly picked up the thread of conversation.
I was just wondering what you were doing, but then...
It's really no bother.
German interjected before she could apologize any further.
This desk has a drawer that gets stuck, so I'm just fixing it.
He dove under once more to finish the job.
Oh, how exciting,
she remarked, but no response came from under the desk. He instead continued with the reparation. Maria was just about to say something that would end the uncomfortable silence when he peeked back out from under the desk, seemingly finished. He had a questioning look on his face.
You think this is interesting?
He said rather accusingly.
Well, why not?
Maria retorted with hidden embarrassment. German placed 2 screwdrivers from the floor into pockets of his work pants and stood up.
Oh, of course. There are loads to show of how one constructs a mundane desk. But if you think this is jaw-dropping, you should see the workshop. Come.
He tilted his head and started walking to the exit. On light steps, she joined him. Emerging from the lecture building, one had the flat stone-laid foundation right in front of them, and the forest in their backs. Beyond the foundation lay the lake, and slightly to the left, a bit away, stood the main building. German guided her directly down the right, and beside the long side of the building. A quaint path led into the forest that halfly swallowed the structure. As they walked, they grew closer and closer to walking straight along the edge of the water. They entered in between the trees, and at the end of the lecture building, where the trees grew even denser, the workshop stood. A quaint cottage with 2 apparent entryways, one situated at the front and another leading into what appeared as a conjoined shack. It was obscured from the lake by bushes and shaded by the reaching crowns of the trees. Evidently, it was here he did most repairs, but also served as his home, fitted with living necessities. He ushered her through the second, less prominent door and lit a lamp that stood in a window directly to the right, below which was a work table. The room truly lived up to being a workshop. Countless cramped shelves, various contraptions and tools hanging from the ceiling. A right and proper mess for anyone who wasn't the worker of the shop.
My word, you live here?
Maria asked fleetingly, as her eyes were fixed on the interior. German chuckled a bit.
That's accurate. Being that I mostly spend all of my time here, the work in this room has even lulled me to sleep on occasions.
She pictured him slumped over the table in deep sleep. The image appeared very humorous, and she laughed mildly. From the workbench, he plucked an odd-looking dagger and gave it to her.
It's something I've been putting together in my spare time. The basis of the prototype was actually made from a pair of hedge trimmers.
It looked very crude, lacking any sort of remarkable handle, only a grip of the same metal as the blade. It was curved in a way reminiscent of a snake's tongue, but the most remarkable feature was the second blade with its edge tucked within the former's. The 2 blades separated from another at the handle, creating an ellipse space in between, then merging once more at the tip. He had remarkably made a cavity within the back of the first blade, where the tip of the second was joined with the former. She felt more closely at the handle, and as she expected, there was a slit that ran along its shape. It could be separated. She carefully started tugging, trying to separate the 2, but had fear for its frailty.
Give it all you got.
She applied more force upon his encouragement, and she felt the blade dislodge itself partially. With a forceful yet sensationally graceful motion, her strength made the blades give way and fold out, finally snapping apart in a metallic sound that emitted bluish sparks. She stared in awe at the two blades in her hands. A surge of emotion came over her that had long been absent. It's made of something called siderite, and it falls from the heavens. The process of identifying it was quite exciting. While still in awe, she swung them about through the air slowly while German smiled reminiscently to himself. The envy of the geologists. Luckily, Willem insisted that I do what I please with my find.
This is wondrous, German.
Her thrill was apparent. The surprise of his character made her almost feel warm inside. I wager this would be more to your liking than some old lecture desk. He crossed his arms and gave her a wide smile.
Much so.
She folded them back together.
Where in the world did you come up with this idea?
It's funny, actually. His smile grew into a leer, and he looked down to his right. From the Knights of Canehurst, in fact. In a way, the fact was a given. She knew well the intricacy of the knights' armaments, and could have seen the resemblance clearly, had it been any other than German, who she previously saw as the very antithesis of Canehurst. She caught herself feeling a slight and irrational sting of disappointment when he associated himself ever so slightly with Canehurst. I know the knights aren't the most popular topic, but when I heard that they hunt vicious beasts and wield uncanny weaponry, I must admit, I was starstruck. It was strange. She had thought to have been attracted to something exceedingly superficial, but there she was uncovering something that was very pure and true. After all, she knew well of what he spoke. Not that I ever pursued the topic. He recovered the dagger and placed it back on the bench. But everyone needs an outlet for their fantasies. Besides, I get bored easily. She moved closer to him, standing right by his side over the bench.
Not many know of the knights. The nobles prefer to leave them out of their lives as much as they can.
And you, back at Canehurst, were you interested in the knights' hunts? He turned around and leaned against the table. That blade fitted very well in your hands, like others of its kind have been in its place. She remembered her Akuyo, a thing she left back home, thinking she would not need it here.
You are right. In younger days, I practiced with one of them. But in due time, my mother thought it was time to become a proper lady. So he gave me a special weapon. He deemed it fitting just for me, as a reminder of those days, I suppose.
She stared longingly out of the window and wished for just a moment she was back home. At least, to the lovely memories of home. You have experience then? All of a sudden, German had stood straight and his calm demeanor had become more spirited. Would you indulge me to have a peek at what you have been taught? His eagerness was somewhat off-putting, but she could clearly see it as genuine.
What? I hardly believe that would be appropriate.
You think? I would not say so. And I don't think you really would either. Maria put her arms assertively on her hips. It's just for fun. What? It's forbidden to jest at Bergenworth? He handed back the dagger to her. Would he suit you? Before she could protest, he had grabbed a rake and left the workshop, leaving her holding the delicate blade limply. She sighed and followed him out onto the patch of trimmed grass just outside the porch. She worried that whatever he had in store, that the trees and the building would not suffice to obscure others' vision of them, despite being in one of the least trafficked areas of the institution.
So what would you have me do? It's not like a dance I can perform for you.
He removed the metal rake from the tip, leaving it just a staff. You attack and I defend, he proposed nonchalantly, standing casually with the former rake planted in the ground.
You're mad. With these, I could cut you.
Her hands shot defiantly to her hips, still clutching the dagger in her right. No, I believe you needn't worry about cutting no one. It was apparent that he wanted her flustered. His face sheepishly accused her of cowardice. That, and the fact that he likely was incredibly ignorant to the true skill of the knights, did indeed fluster her.
Fine.
She yelled and separated the blade in a more proficient and satisfying manner.
I'll show you all right, but no complaining over the tattered clothes I leave you in.
She ducked down and leapt forward. She intended to dart past him and cut shallowly at his shoulder, but she only caught him with a mildly surprised expression before he was gone. Just like that. No more German. She stumbled slightly as she was caught in astonishment of his speed, turned around and found him standing slightly behind her left. She spun around and kicked out with her leg to sweep him off his feet, but German only moved with a quick step backwards. Now he grabbed the staff with 2 hands and thrusted it towards her. He was much quicker than she thought, but she could still easily match his pace. She dodged the forward attack and leapt in on his right side. As she prepared to make good on her words of making tatters of his clothes, German was gone again in a blur. Had it not been that he dodged away in her line of view, and she could see his movement, the maneuver might have been considered supernatural.
Stop it!
She involuntarily yelled at him as she saw his foolish grin. Keep up. He was stifling a laugh. She quietly emitted a sound resembling an angry cat before lunging after to bombard him with quick stabs and swings. He expertly evaded each blow by slowly shifting his body and backing away. Eventually she caught him with a slice on the arm. She made but a brief pause out of concern that it was more reactionary than it was conscious. In that very brief moment, with disregard to the wound, he slammed away her blade with his staff and moved to her side. He swung from behind her, but she ducked and successfully performed a swiping kick to his legs. He fell forward, but converted the fall into a roll. Dangerously quick, he raced onto his knees and simultaneously turned his body into a full frontal swing aimed directly at the surprised Maria's face. He stopped the blow before the impact, and she felt only the force of the staff's swing touch her face, barely causing a flinch. Both were now panting.
My... German.
She could not help but smile from the sheer astonishment she experienced.
Forgive me.
German quickly composed himself and sat down on the grass.
I just... had to see.
Your arm!
Her voice cracked slightly. He looked down, unmoved by her tone.
Oh, it's nothing. Barely bleeds.
She breathed out the last of her fatigue and sat down where she was.
Where did you learn all that?
He raised his eyebrows. His eyes were serene and his mouth smiled contently and vaguely.
Here and there, with friends, fighting when necessary.
Friends? With Lawrence?
At times with Lawrence, yes.
I underestimated you, I admit. But pardon me for strongly doubting Lawrence.
He isn't much of a sparring partner, you're right. But now...
He trailed off. He examined her, appearing concerned, indecisive.
I have taken much of your time. I'm sure you have other occupations.
She was surprised at his absconded thrill that had previously been so alive. He appeared almost ashamed.
What? No, well, yes, but...
It was dismaying, and she found herself missing dearly the part of him that was so enthusiastic, even if it were for something so peculiar.
But, German, I don't mind doing this again.
He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked back towards the main building, retaining his uncertain demeanor. Then it vanished, and he looked intently at her.
Maria, well, Master Willem and I are putting together a program of sorts.
Oh?
It is rather unique, and it has been pretty idle for some days now.
What might this program be?
He fell silent again. German often spoke carefully and calmly, placing every word with thought. Because of this, it was apparent in his strange new tone that he harbored uncertainty, perhaps even some timidness in his approach.
It is a defense. Guards for expeditions from unnatural threats. Does it sound strange?
No. It does sound intriguing.
Good. It might be a bit out of place, but that's the gist of it. I have thought long now on how I should train more guardians, but it occurs to me now, with you, that I myself have more to learn.
Ah, it all does sound like an arduous ordeal.
Indeed. But we get along quite well, don't we?
He flashed a smile, a gesture she returned. Then, upon standing himself up, she found her body to be lighter as she followed him.
Come, Willem can tell you more, now that we can finally begin.
On their way back towards the main building, both appearing slightly disheveled from their tumble, she could not properly contain her excitement. And judging by German's pace, neither could he. Never had she felt something quite like it, incomparable to walking to a lecture on the most engaging subjects. The feeling of delving into the unknown from a desk, now taking on a new property, one much more potent as she was now living the experience, walking towards the unknown. Nothing of her experiences so far at Bergenworth had been quite like it. There was some activity in the building. Willem was sitting at his reception desk in the middle of the lower floor, while students sat at the other end of the hall in curved couches studying. There were footsteps heard from the second floor, and one could see them walk about from below. German and Maria waited as two other students were currently showing Willem some papers. He finally nodded, and they left hurriedly.
German, Maria.
He leaned back and awaited them to speak their mind.
Master Willem, I believe I have found a partner for our program.
He promptly stood, giving Maria a foreboding glare.
Come.
He sounded uncharacteristically sharp and proceeded to walk up the curving stair to the second floor, through the door and out to the lunarium. There he waited for them to close the door after they both were outside. He turned to German, looking menacingly annoyed.
Explain, please.
She fits perfectly. There's not much more to it. I know her character and now I have also seen her ability.
Willem walked over to the stone railing, hands at his back and looking down to the grounds below.
I am starting to have my doubts, German, considering your choice. How much do you know, Maria?
Well, that German leads some program to enroll protectors.
He chuckled humorlessly and slowly approached German.
I want to believe this means as much to you as it does to me. But nevertheless, I will see this done rightly.
It will, but you can't just send about anyone in there. You know that.
Willem glared, but German gave him an indicative look that receded the provost's hostility.
You are right. I should know.
He glanced over at her.
Can you two please explain?
So far it felt like they had intentionally left out the most vital part, whatever it was.
Sorry, Maria. It's just hard to explain.
Rather, it's a lengthy explanation,
Willem interrupted.
So I'll resort to your judgment of her and leave this story's telling to you. What you need to know for now, Maria, is that there indeed is a force that will be schooled by German. We seek to explore the previously hidden Thumerian labyrinth that unexpectedly housed a number of guardians. The whole affair is shrouded in mystery, but I am confident that German can produce a force that will let us explore its halls. He has for a time now brewed up a plan, as it seems, and now he is ready to set it in motion, with you as his first apprentice.
Apprentice?
German shoved her in a low, playful manner.
Well, your technique needs some work, and admittedly, so do mine.